Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Blake Shelton called Texoma Shore. So here's the frustrating thing about this review. If you're not a Blake Shelton fan or peripherally interested in mainstream country, I have no idea what I could say to make this remotely interesting. Because let's face it, Blake Shelton is on his 11th album. He co-wrote only one of 11 songs on it. And with the lead-off single, a set of co-writers that he has, I had no reason to expect anything new or remotely challenging. It wasn't like Bringing Up the Sun, where there was a very real question how he could pivot out of bro country, or like If I'm Honest, when the only real reason that I wanted to review that album was the fallout of his failed marriage to Miranda Lambert and what he could be building with Gwen Stefani. But this time around, he explicitly said that he wanted this album to reflect where he is now, that's just happy and going with the flow. In other words, going into Texoma Shore, this felt like a record where Blake Shelton was just punching the clock. It was shorter, it looked to be heading back to his adult contemporary style that made for pleasant and sedate, but not remotely interesting music. It had the feel of an artist who was just looking to coast off for a little bit. Hell, he's even using the exact same producer and a lot of the same songwriters as he's used before. So in other words, I'm probably going to end up repeating some things that I said in my last two Blake Shelton reviews over the past couple of years. But you know, even if he's not trying, I might as well give this my fair due diligence. So what did I find on Texoma Shore? Honestly folks, there's not a lot to say about this record. If it's passable, it only barely gets there. And it's definitely not adding anything all that distinct to the Blake Shelton canon. But what I think I find more frustrating about this is that I was hoping that it would be more decent and passable than it is. Instead, we got one song that might be one of the most aggressively worthless things I've heard all year. And instead of genuinely great tracks, we get a smattering of good tunes that don't quite get all the way there above all the filler. In other words, a day after you've probably heard this album, you and I are probably going to forget that it even exists, like what happens with nearly every Blake Shelton song that's not overplayed to hell and back in this decade. But again, I get why Blake Shelton is overplayed, because as a performer, he does have some charms to him. For one, he's a more naturally expressive singer, and he's got enough charisma to elevate some otherwise pretty basic material. It's one thing that elevates him over the rather generic smoothness of someone like Chris Young. Blake Shelton and his songwriters, they tend to add a little bit more flavor melodically, and it helps that there tends to be a little bit more fiddle and pedal steel, more neo-traditional elements to fit in with the electric and acoustic guitars. On this record, Blake Shelton is very much playing in his adult contemporary country zone, and he knows it, and honestly, for the most part, it's generally agreeable. Granted, you would expect such a comfort zone to have a little bit more sophistication, and Blake Shelton has a bad tendency to go broad in both his singing and some of his production choices. I mean, why, for instance, he thought those squealing electric tones on Hangover Do and At the House, as well as that annoying as hell whistle and funk elements on the latter, why he thought those were a good idea, I have no clue. Or that bassy tone that swamps out the bottom of Beside You Babe, or the faux country rap squonk on Money that easily makes it one of the worst things that Blake Shelton has ever recorded. And that's saying something, especially as he should never have tried rapping. Ever. And when you combine it all with entirely too many places where the percussion feels more synthetic than ever, it leads to a record that's really trying to sound a lot more slick, but not really supported by Blake Shelton's vocal delivery, which is rougher and more nasal and a lot less subtle. Now, that's not saying that he can't play to restraint. Turning Me On sticks more with some minor tones, and yeah, it works surprisingly well, as does the piano and the acoustic interplay of Got the T-Shirt, or against the more traditional restrained pedal steel on I Lived It, but that's sadly not the norm on this album, and it doesn't help this record feel more mature or adult, if that's saying anything. So yeah, about that. Where Blake Shelton has been getting some praise is that his lyrics, well, they've settled back into the adult contemporary mold, that he's actually grown up a little bit with his music and songwriting in comparison with a lot of his peers like Luke Bryan or Keith Urban. And you know, I'm a lot less convinced. For one, most of the content in this record feels awfully samey. The sort of half-intoxicated hookup and love jams that you know he's gonna put out, they're intended to sound sensual and kind of playful, but tend to default to kind of sloppy when you start looking at the details. Now, I can accept I'll Name the Dogs for playing a little bit corny. It's basically a broad country proposal song, but At the House is about partying at home with your significant other and losing her underwear in the couch, and Hangover 2 tries him to make some pounding morning hangover with a partner sound cute. Trust me, it never is. Then we get Money, which tries to play for I'm Dirt Broke so we can only wipe our ass with a one-ply Charmin, but since we have you in secondhand cutoffs, it's okay, and it's so over-detailed to not appeal flattering or likable to anyone. I'd probably say it's just trying way too hard in some of these details, especially when we all know that Blake Shelton is one of the richest artists in Nashville right now. It comes across as so phony. And incidentally, when you're trying to make a song about how people don't understand your rural background and I lived it, maybe it would be a good idea to actually have a writing credit on that song if you're playing for authenticity. Now that said, outside of minor nitpicks like how anyone would sleep on a bed where half a glass of wine was spilled on it when the wine wears off, there's a general sense of sincerity and some lived-in detail that helps some of these tracks feel at least somewhat grounded, and Got the T-shirt actually has a pretty solid metaphor at its core. It knows people who will just coast through relationships just for the experience and the memories, taking something that they might consider pretty disposable at the end, but what could mean so much more to the other partner. It's a good concept, it's good execution, I like it, probably one of the better songs on this record. But here is the larger question. At this point of Blake Shelton's career, I've got similar complaints to what I've said about, let's say, older established acts in hip-hop, like say Jay-Z before 2017, who chose to coast for years rather than innovate or expand artistically when they could. Given Blake Shelton's presence in country culture and his grounding with the radio, who would pretty much play anything he puts out there, he conceivably could release whatever the hell he wants and he would get traction in radio play. And yet he chooses not to, because Texoma Shore is no 444. Sure, it might satisfy his base, but even I can't see many of them holding on to this for that long. So it's getting a strong 5 out of 10 from me, and only a recommendation if you're a die-hard fan, and by then you've already picked up this album and won't care what I have to say anyway. If you like his adult contemporary country style, you'll get more of what you've heard before, and yet otherwise, again, you've heard it all before. It's not an essential listen. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Not a lot to say about this one, folks. You've heard this before. It's a Blake Shelton record. Honestly, not that. I'm amazed I've got this much to say. But if you want to buy the record, links in the description below. Got the poll up there for all you to tell me how wrong I am. If you guys want to get involved in supporting this channel, or potentially have some requests, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week the patrons get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors you get to add records, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. A lot of stuff's coming up before the end of the year. I'm trying to get to as much as I possibly can. Very grateful for all your support. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation? I'm all ears. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.